As the hour is late, I thought I would do something a little different today, and that is to teach something together rather than a more of a formal sermon. I'm hoping it will be shorter than a sermon. We'll see. I'll do my best. But where I'm going to be is on page 24. So if you want to open your Chumash now and join us, that would be great. I received the news about Judge Kavanaugh that things were likely moving forward while I was at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture yesterday. We had an outing for alumni of the civil rights tour that a number of our congregants took to the Deep South to see the new lynching museum and to learn about the history and sordid legacy of chattel slavery in this country, and about Jim Crow and about civil rights. And so there I was in the building while I got a notification on my Apple Watch telling me that they had secured enough votes to move the nomination forward. And there was something, I guess, ironic and appropriate in a fairly devastating way at the moment, because I was contemplating how we view human beings and treat human beings and the objectification of human beings and the ways in which our ability to reduce human beings into something less than fully human has enabled people in power, usually men, to do things to people with less power, whether it's people of color or Jews or women, for as long as there have been human beings. Where was I at the exact moment? I was actually in a part of the historical exhibit where you're kind of inside the bows of a slave ship, and there are they've collected actual ballast, ship ballast, that they have there in the museum. And these are iron weights. And why did they need so many iron weights in these ships? Well, they needed them in order to counterbalance the cargo, which was light, which was too light than ships are designed to carry. Of course, the cargo they were carrying were not goods, but human beings. And they needed all of this balance to be able to transport even many, many human beings crammed into these boats, these ships, where so many died on the journey, let alone what they endured when they arrived to this country and to the Caribbean. So there I was, contemplating the ballast and contemplating human life and human value and contemplating what it meant to advance this nomination after what we've heard. And so, obviously, of the things that Judge Kavanaugh has been accused of, he certainly hasn't been accused of being a murderer, and I am not trying to draw a straight line in any way to that. But I did think it might be useful at this moment, both because of this week in terms of how we think about human dignity, but also because yesterday we got word that Jason Van Dyke, the officer in Chicago, was convicted of murder of Laquan Daniels. And if you watch that unfold since 2015, this was one of many cases in which a police officer killed a black man. In this case, the evidence, as the jury determined, was overwhelming that this person was defenseless at the moment. If you saw the video, I think it's pretty clear. So I thought it might be interesting for a few minutes today to contemplate the very first murder, which occurs in our Parsha. And you'll find it beginning on page 24. And what I want to do is just quickly take us through a close reading of this text. V'adam yada et Chava ishto, V'tahar v'teled et Cain v'tomer kaniti ish et Adonai. Now the man knew, or perhaps had known, his wife, Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have acquired, or I have produced a male child with the help of the Lord. V'tosef laledet et achiv et Hevel, v'hi Hevel re'atzon, v'Cain haya oved adama. And she then bore an additional child named Hevel, Abel, who was a tender of the flocks. He was a keeper of sheep. And Cain became a farmer, became a tiller of the soil. And already we know something about these characters by their names, particularly the name Hevel. What does Hevel mean? It means vapor. Right? It's sometimes treated in the book of of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, as vanity or futility, and it can mean that. But actually, Hevel is like, if you take a pane glass on a cold day, and you go, what forms on the glass, that's Hevel. What do we know about Hevel? It is ephemeral. Right? It disappears, it doesn't last, and so too will be the fate of this second child of Adam and Eve. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the soil. And Hevel, Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. So what do we know in the lead up to this murder? We know that Cain actually didn't do a bad job. Right? We're not told that Cain brought the worst that he could. He just brought an offering. He brought an average offering to God. But Hevel made a point of bringing the firstlings of his flock, and that's going to make the difference in terms of what happens in response. The Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. Again, think about yourself as a parent, those of you who are parents or any of us who have been raised by parents, and those moments where you do something that's praiseworthy and your sibling does something that maybe is not as praiseworthy and you get some praise for that, right? That's kind of how parenting goes. That, you learn by that hopefully positive reinforcement to continue to do things that are maybe a little better than average, and hopefully over time our children learn to do more of those things more often. So we don't have here an example of negative reinforcement. Nobody's getting punished in the moment, but Hevel gets some attention for what he did. But to Cain, ve'el Cain, ve'el minchato lo sha'a, ve'ichar l'Cain me'od, va'iplu panav. And so what happens? Ve'ichar, Cain gets very upset, and his face falls. And I want to read to you something that Rav Joseph Soloveitchik says about this moment, because I think it's really interesting. And it angered Cain exceedingly, and his countenance fell. Sin emanates from two sources. Sin can result from anger. When confronted with God's rejection of his offering, Cain could not accept the implicit rebuke. He maintained that his own understanding was always unerring, even in religious matters. But he goes on, there is, however, another opposite type of sinner alluded to by the latter phrase in this verse, and his countenance fell. Here, sin results not from arrogance, but rather from self-negation. This type of sinner is subservient to everything and everyone. He is a spiritual wanderer. He does not want to sin, yet submits to temptation. He wants to repent, but feels he cannot. He senses the call of holiness, but does not answer. And so what I want us to think about as we get into the moment of the murder itself is not just the actions of the person who is the victim of the crime, but also the mental state of the murderer. How many terrible things are done by people who have such a low sense of themselves, right? A sense of self-negation, who feel humiliated, who feel put down, whether they have a right to feel that way or not. Actually, oftentimes they don't have a right. If you watched, Trevor Noah had a brilliant thing this week where he was talking about the ways in which the current president, but also like people in general in power, and men frequently will turn what's an advantage into a perceived sense of disadvantage. I'm the one attacked, right? It's white men, it's Christians in a Christian nation, right? We have to watch out, because how can we possibly, give in to somebody who raises questions about sexual assault? Because then that's going to open up a can of worms for anyone who wants to accuse anyone of sexual assault. Of course, we know demonstrably that's not the case, but that is a tool, it's a weapon that people in power will use when they feel threatened, when they're afraid, and that fear can be a very powerful weapon to suppress the lesser, or the person who they view as a lesser person. And so we'll go on and see what happens. And the Lord said to Cain, right? God's not going to give up. He's not going to say, okay, just, you're nothing to me. Why are you distressed? Why is your face fallen? Surely if you do right, there is uplift. God says, it's okay. Next time you're going to do a little better, and then I'll give you attention. I'll give you credit. And now here, listen to this, because it's very interesting if you want to understand the human condition. You would think the second part of the phrase, if we say, if you do good, you'll be rewarded, the next part of the phrase would be, if you do bad, you will be punished. But that's not what it says. Actually, what we get here is the Torah teaching us about the complexity of evil in the world, and also the complexity that is the gift of human free will. Notice the second part says, V'im lo teitiv, if you don't do good, lefetach chatat rovetz ve'elecha teshukato va'atat timshol bo. If you don't do good, right? If you don't do right, as it translates here, it's not that there's going to be punishment. Maybe there will, maybe there won't. Maybe you'll get away with it. But there is this thing, there is a force. Here it says, sin crouches at the door. Think about a beast sort of crouching. What's the door? Door is a liminal space. It represents a transition from maybe the scary world outside the door to the safe space within, but sin is always there crouching at the door. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that you have to be a victim to that. That doesn't mean that you have to give in to that. Just be aware of it. Be vigilant about it, because its urges toward you, yet you can conquer it. Right? You can do this. Human free will, being created in the image of God, being a reflection of God in the universe, means that though there are forces in the universe that try to get human beings to do bad, we call it the Yetzer Hara in our tradition, this impulse toward bad, that doesn't have to be how we define ourselves. That doesn't have to be how we behave. We don't have to give in. And then we get the actual moment itself. And what we're left with in this moment is perhaps the biggest question in the Torah, which is a book of really big questions. Because what does it say? Vayomer Cain el hevel achiv, and Cain said to his brother Abel, we don't know. We have no idea what Cain said to his brother Abel. Because the very next thing that it says is, Vayhi b'hiotam basadeh, vayakom Cain el hevel achiv, v'yahargehu. And they were in the field, and Cain took it upon himself to murder his brother. We don't actually know what transpired. Now, we know there was this frustration that Cain was feeling, this anger, this sense of self-negation. But we don't actually know what transpired in this moment. And actually, commentators have really grappled with this question of what was actually said. Some of the commentators said something to the effect of, he said, hey, come out to the field. I have something to talk to you about, and then he killed him, right? That this was a premeditated murder. But that doesn't have to be how we read it. Maybe it was a crime of passion. Maybe in the moment he just lost control of himself. In fact, the Septuagint and the Vulgate, the Greek and Latin translations, actually do take that approach. They translate, Cain said to his brother Abel, let us go into the field. And when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. But another approach might be that this is even more premeditated, that this is actually a dispute, well, more and less. It's a dispute between two parties about the very nature of ownership. And when we think about power and the abuse of power, often coming right behind is the consideration of who gets to claim what. And this is what Breshit Rabbah says. Come, they said, let us divide the world. After all, they are the first two human beings born to the first couple created by God. Let us divide the world. One took the land, and the other took the chattel, right? One became a farmer, and the other became a shepherd. One had permanent property, one had movable goods. The former said, because there's a problem when you claim in this way, the former said, by the way, the land you're standing on is mine. Cain said to Abel, okay, the land is mine, get off my land. Well, Abel said, the clothes you're wearing are mine. Okay, fine. If you're in charge of the land, I'm in charge of all of the property that you can sell and trade, and you're wearing my clothes. And that just devolved from there. Another opinion, Rabbi Yeshua of Sichnin said in Rabbi Levi's name, they split the land in chattels, so what did they quarrel about? They found a way to divide it. One said the temple will be built in my area, while the other claimed it would be built in mine. And so we have very early on, fascinatingly, the rabbis willing to say that religion, if misused as an institution, can actually lead to the worst kind of human behavior. Not that religion is bad, but that it is a tool that can be used for good and for ill. And finally, I'll throw this in because, again, apropos this week, Yehuda bar Rabbi said they quarreled over a woman. So we're going to conclude here, but I want us to see what actually happens in the end. How does God react to this first act of the annihilation of one of God's reflections in the world by another? The Lord said to Cain, Hevel achicha, where is your brother Abel? Vayomer lo yadati, hashomer achi anochi? And Cain responds, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? You'll notice that God doesn't answer that question, but God's response, of course, is the answer. Vayomer me asita kol demei achicha tzoakim alai min ha'adama. God says, what have you done? Your brother's blood cries out from the earth, cries out from the ground. And then God goes on to curse Cain and to make him into a nomadic wanderer. And the complexity of the text, because we could go on for a long time, which we're not, will continue to offer hints about who these people are, how are they perhaps paradigmatic examples of who we are, Jews, but also human beings. So far, I'll give you just one example. When God banishes Cain and Cain says, well, I can't handle this, God actually forgives him, even though maybe he never truly asked for forgiveness and maybe doesn't even deserve it. And what happens? Cain leaves the presence of the Lord and settles in Be'eretz Nod. What does Nod mean? Nod is wandering. And so we have here a fascinating statement that Cain maybe settles or maybe never does. Maybe he wanders the earth, and the guy who was in fact the farmer, the one who tries to claim the land, the one who tries to work the soil, having destroyed a human life, now is ripped from the land, always to wander. Having polluted the ground with the blood of his brother, now the land will not abide him to stay anywhere for too long, and so he is condemned to wander for the rest of his life. And so here's what I want to say by way of confusion and of conclusion, perhaps. That's interesting, because I think it is confusing as well. I mentioned a few times that this is about the lessening of a human being. When people harm other people, inevitably they justify it by somehow a claim that that person is less deserving than I am, or than some of the people I identify with. We do that in all kinds of ways. There is scientific evidence for why we do this, that it's actually baked into our DNA, that it was formed in our consciousness very early on as human beings became human beings, that there is this outgroup distinction of those people who live in that cave are not my people who live in this cave. But whatever the case, we see in this a deep wisdom in the text that doesn't try to tie everything up neatly with a bow. Cain isn't just punished and executed because humanity has to continue. And what we get here, and I was bringing this up with my Torah study class this morning, is two kind of fundamental questions of an intra-textual debate going on in the Torah. One is a question about sex and sexuality, which we're not going to get into now, but the question of where was Cain conceived is a really intriguing question, whether he was conceived in the Garden of Eden or after the Garden of Eden, and one that different faith traditions have landed in different places on. But the second one is the question of what happens to the first murderer. And if you look at the text, the end of chapter 4 presents a genealogy that we didn't hear today, and chapter 5 presents another genealogy. Those genealogies are remarkably similar. And you actually see between those texts names that are either the same or are similar to one another. And what might be happening, what I want to suggest to you is in fact happening, is along with the first murder, is our sacred document offering us the first big question, which is, what do we do with generational inheritance? How do we think of ourselves in this generation and our responsibilities to the next generation? And what are the ways that people in this generation use previous generations either as an inspiration to do good or an excuse to do bad? I don't have to tell you that both of those impulses, all of those impulses, exist very much in our day in the 21st century. Shabbat Shalom.